Harlem never introduced its strongest men with noise. It revealed them slowly, the way night reveals the city piece by piece, shadow by shadow, until you realize something powerful has been there all along. In the early hours, when the streetlights hummed and the last notes of jazz drifted out of club doors like fading memories, there was a rhythm to the neighborhood that only a few understood. It wasn't just music or movement. It was survival, dignity, and the quiet agreement between people who had seen enough of the world to know that not everything needed to be said out loud. Bumpy Johnson moved through that rhythm like he belonged to it, not as a man trying to control it, but as one who understood it. He never rushed, never forced his presence into a room, and yet somehow, every room he entered adjusted itself around him. Chairs seemed to settle. Conversations slowed. Even the air felt different, as if it recognized something steady in a world that rarely stood still. People who didn't know him often made the same mistake. They looked at him and saw calm, and in that calm, they assumed absence. Absence of fear. Absence of power. But calm, in a man like Bumpy, was not emptiness. It was control earned, sharpened, and protected. The truth was, Bumpy had long ago learned something most men never did. The loudest person in the room is usually the least certain. And certainty, real certainty, doesn't need volume. That understanding had carried him through moments that would have broken others. It had guided him through rooms where he wasn't wanted, conversations where he wasn't respected, and situations where dignity was treated like something optional. But he never adjusted himself to match those environments. He remained exactly who he was, no more, no less, and that was what made him dangerous in a way no one could quite explain. That it started with something small. It always did. A shop on Lenox Avenue, nothing special to anyone passing by. Just another storefront among many closed its doors one afternoon and didn't reopen the next day. The sign remained hanging, slightly crooked, as if someone had left in a hurry or simply stopped caring enough to straighten it. For most people, it was just another business gone. Harlem had seen plenty of those, but Bumpy noticed. He didn't ask loudly. He didn't gather attention. He asked the way a man asks when he already expects the answer, quietly, carefully, letting the truth come to him instead of chasing it. The first person he spoke to avoided eye contact. The second answered in half sentences. The third said nothing at all but gave a look that said more than words ever could. And that was enough. Fear had arrived. Not the sudden kind that comes with chaos, but the quiet kind, the kind that settles in and makes people adjust their behavior without realizing it. Doors closed earlier, conversations shortened. Eyes looked away a second too soon, and fear like that doesn't come from nothing. That evening, Bumpy sat in a corner of a dimly lit club where the piano played soft enough to feel like a memory instead of a performance. The room was alive, but not careless. People laughed, but not too loudly. Spoke, but not too openly. Harlem knew how to continue living, even when something underneath it had shifted. Dutch Schultz stood near the bar, watching. Dutch was not a man known for patience. He understood the world in sharper terms: action, reaction, dominance, control. Where Bumpy observed, Dutch acted. Where Bumpy waited, Dutch moved. And yet, there was something about Bumpy that held his attention in a way he couldn't fully explain. "You're too quiet tonight," Dutch said finally, stepping closer, his voice low but edged with curiosity. Bumpy didn't look up right away. When he did, his expression didn't change. "People are louder when they're hiding something," he replied. Dutch let out a short breath that might have been a laugh, but it didn't carry humor. "And what are they hiding?" Bumpy's gaze drifted across the room, not searching, not scanning, just observing. "The same thing they always hide," he said calmly. "Fear, just dressed differently." Dutch followed his line of sight, but saw nothing unusual. Just people, just a room, just another night in Harlem. But Bumpy wasn't looking at what was visible. He was looking at what had changed, And something had. The stories began to connect. Not through announcements or declarations, but through fragments. A man turned away from his own business. A quiet warning delivered without witnesses. A presence that didn't belong, but didn't need to belong to take. Control that it wasn't chaos, that it was organized, and that made it worse. Because chaos can be resisted. Chaos burns fast, but control settles in. Dutch leaned against the bar, arms crossed, his patience thinning. So what are you going to do about it? Bumpy finally turned his attention fully to him. Not defensive, not confrontational. Just steady, nothing, he said. Dutch frowned. Nothing? For now. That was the part Dutch never liked, the waiting. To him, waiting looked like weakness, like hesitation, like missed opportunity. But Bumpy didn't see it that way. Waiting to him was understanding. You don't stop something like this by reacting to it, Bumpy continued, his voice calm, measured. You stop it by knowing exactly what it is. Dutch shook his head slightly. Or you stop it by making sure it doesn't happen again. Bumpy didn't argue, he didn't need to. He simply held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. As if the conversation had already reached its conclusion, because in his mind, it had. Later that night, when the streets grew quieter and the city seemed to exhale, a message arrived. Not delivered with urgency, not wrapped in threat, but carrying both. A meeting. Polite words. Careful tone. A request that wasn't really a request. Dutch read it once and scoffed. You're not seriously considering this. Bumpy folded the paper once neatly, as if it mattered more how it was handled than what it contained. I am. Dutch stared at him. You don't walk into something like that alone. Bumpy's expression didn't change. I wasn't asked to bring anyone. That's the point. Bumpy stood, adjusting his coat slightly, the movement unhurried, deliberate. If they wanted a crowd, he said quietly, they would have invited one. Dutch stepped closer, lowering his voice. This isn't a conversation, it's a setup. Bumpy met his eyes, and for a brief moment, something deeper passed between them. Not agreement, not disagreement, but understanding. Only, if I walk in like one, Bumpy said. Dutch didn't respond immediately. He studied him, searching for something, doubt, hesitation, anything that would suggest this was a mistake. Bumpy might reconsider, but there was nothing, because Bumpy Johnson had already decided. And when a man like that decides something, the thing to outcome may be uncertain, but the direction never is. The next evening, Harlem felt different again, not louder, not quieter. Just aware. As if the city itself knew something was about to happen, not something explosive, not something chaotic, but something that would shift the balance in a way no one could immediately see. Bumpy walked through it the same way he always did. No hurry, no tension, no visible concern, but inside his mind was sharp, focused, precise. He wasn't walking into a meeting. He was walking into a test, and not of strength, of control, because real control isn't about what you can force. It's about what you refuse to become. As he stepped toward the building where 15 men were already waiting, already confident, already certain of how this would unfold. There was no hesitation in him, only clarity, and sometimes clarity is the most dangerous thing a man can carry into a room that expects confusion. The building did not look important from the outside, and that was precisely the point. It stood there like any other structure, brick, narrow windows, a door that did not invite attention. But places like that were never chosen by accident. They were chosen because they concealed intention. Because what happened inside them was meant to stay contained, like a secret no one would dare repeat out loud. When Bumpy Johnson approached it, the street behind him carried its usual rhythm, distant voices, a passing car, the faint hum of a city that refused to sleep completely. But the closer he got to the door, the quieter everything felt, as if the world itself were stepping back. leaving him alone with what waited ahead. He did not pause. He opened the door and stepped inside. The hallway was long, narrow and dimly lit, not dark enough to hide anything, but not bright enough to feel comfortable. It forced awareness. Every step echoed just enough to remind him that he was being heard, even if he wasn't being seen. And somewhere beyond that corridor, 15 men were waiting men who believed they understood how this night would end. At the far end of the hallway, a single door stood slightly ajar. That was where the laughter came from. It spilled out before he even reached it, sharp, confident, rehearsed. The kind of laughter that wasn't about humor, but about dominance. It was meant to be heard, meant to travel, meant to greet him. Before any words were exchanged, most men would have slowed down. Bumpy didn't single quotes to that. He pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room. 15 faces turned toward him, and the laughter grew louder, not because anything had changed, but because now they had something to direct it at. The room itself was carefully arranged. Chairs positioned in a loose circle. No clear head, no obvious leader. That, too, was intentional. It created the illusion of unity, of shared power, of a collective force that did not rely on any one man. But illusions only work when no one questions them. And Bumpy questioned everything. He didn't speak. He didn't react. He simply walked forward, each step measured, each movement controlled, as if he had entered a room that belonged to no one and therefore could not intimidate him. The laughter continued, but something about it had already begun to change. It wasn't obvious. Not yet, but it was there. A man on the left leaned back in his chair, his smile wide, his tone dripping with mockery. "Well, I'll be," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He really came alone." Another voice followed quickly, overlapping. "Didn't think you'd have the nerve." More laughter, but Bumpy didn't respond to any of it. He reached an empty space in the circle and stopped, not standing too close, not too far. Just enough to be present without appearing defensive. His posture remained straight, his expression calm, his eyes steady. He wasn't scanning the room like a man searching for threats. He was observing it like a man, measuring truth. Dutch Schultz stood off to the side, partially in shadow, his presence known but not central. He had insisted on being there, but not as part of the confrontation. He wanted to see this unfold, to understand it, because something about Bumpy's approach defied the rules he had spent his life following, and right now, it was doing something even stranger. It was disrupting the room. The laughter should have continued, should have grown, should have overwhelmed the moment until Bumpy was forced to react, but it didn't. It stretched, then thinned, then lingered. Just a second too long, because Bumpy wasn't giving them anything to push against, and without resistance, their performance had nowhere to go. One of the men leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Bumpy more closely. "You know what this is?" he asked, his tone shifting, not softer but sharper, more direct. Bumpy met his gaze. "A room," he said simply. A few chuckles followed, but they were different now. Less certain, less unified. The man's smile tightened. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "This is where things get decided." Bumpy tilted his head just enough to acknowledge the statement, but not enough to agree with it. "That depends," he replied calmly. "On what?" Another voice cut in quickly. Bumpy's eyes moved, not hurriedly, but deliberately, from one face to another. "On who's actually deciding?" That was the first moment the room truly shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Because until that point, they had believed the structure itself gave them control. The numbers, the setup, the environment. But now, that certainty had been questioned, and not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. Dutch noticed it immediately. The way shoulders adjusted. The way one man leaned back slightly while another leaned forward. The way eye contact broke for just a fraction of a second before returning. These were small things, but small things are where control begins to slip. The man who had spoken first sat up straighter, his tone sharpening again as he tried to reclaim the moment. "Let's not waste time," he said. "You know why you're here." Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He let the silence sit, not as a tactic, as a choice, because silence, when used correctly, forces others to fill it and in doing so, reveal more than they intend. "You've been asking questions," another man added, "about things that don't concern you." Bumpy's expression didn't change. A man losing his livelihood concerns more than just him. A pause. "Not long, but enough. That's not your responsibility," someone said from the far side of the room. Bumpy's gaze shifted in that direction. "Responsibility doesn't ask permission," he replied. That landed, not like an attack, but like a weight, because it challenged something deeper than the situation itself. It challenged the idea that they had the right to decide what mattered and what did in single quotes. The tension in the room began to tighten, not explosively, gradually, like a rope being pulled from both ends, 1 inch at a time. Dutch felt it in the air, the shift from mockery to something more focused, more deliberate. The laughter was gone now, replaced by attention. Real attention. And attention meant the balance was changing. One of the men stood up slowly, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. The sound cut through the room, drawing every eye for just a moment. He stepped forward, not aggressively, but with intent. "Let's make this simple," he said. "You walk away from this, and things stay the way they are." Bumpy looked at him. "Not up, not down, just directly." "And if I don't?" he asked. The man smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then things get complicated." There it was, the line they had been building toward, the moment they expected to tip the balance. But Bumpy didn't react the way they anticipated. He didn't tense, didn't step back, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he took a single step forward, and everything stopped. The movement was small, but in a room like that, it was louder than any threat, because it wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. The man in front of him hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But that was enough. Bumpy's voice, when he spoke again, was lower than before, but carried further. "You're confusing control with noise," he said. "No anger, no accusation, just clarity. And you think this room gives you power." Another pause. Longer this time. Because now, no one wanted to interrupt, but power doesn't come from being surrounded. Bumpy continued. "It comes from being certain." The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, deeper. Because now, it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of realization. Dutch exhaled slowly, almost without noticing it. He had seen confrontations before. He had been part of them, but this wasn't confrontation. This was control being redefined in real time, and the men who had laughed just minutes ago were no longer laughing. There's a moment in every confrontation where everything that looked solid begins to show its cracks. Not loudly, not dramatically, just small fractures, barely visible at first, until the weight of truth presses hard enough to make them impossible to ignore. In that room, that moment did not arrive with a shout or a threat. It arrived with stillness. After Bumpy Johnson stepped forward, the air changed. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was something more unfamiliar. Something the men in that room were not used to feeling. Uncertainty. The man standing in front of Bumpy held his ground, but his posture had shifted ever so slightly. His shoulders were still squared, his expression still firm. But something behind his eyes had begun to question what his mind had already decided. Because for the first time since Bumpy entered, the situation was no longer unfolding according to expectation, and expectation, once disrupted, is difficult to rebuild. No one spoke. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of thoughts, of recalculations, of quiet realizations forming in real time. Bumpy did not rush to fill it. He stood there, composed, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if he had all the time in the world, and in that moment, it felt like he did. Dutch Schultz, watching from the edge of the room, felt something shift inside himself as well. He had always believed that power was about pressure, about forcing the other side into a corner until they had no options left. But what he was witnessing now was the opposite. Bumpy wasn't cornering anyone, he was removing their certainty. And, without certainty, men begin to unravel in ways they cannot control. One of the seated men cleared his throat, the sound cutting awkwardly through the silence. It wasn't planned. It wasn't strategic. It was instinct, the kind that comes when a man feels something slipping and doesn't know how to stop it. "You think you're in a position to question us?" he said, his tone sharper than before, but not as steady. Bumpy turned his head slightly, acknowledging the voice without shifting his stance. "I'm not questioning you," he replied. A pause. "I'm listening." That answer didn't relieve the tension. It deepened it, because listening, in that moment, felt more dangerous than arguing. Arguing would have been familiar, predictable, something they could respond to, but listening meant he was gathering something, understanding something. And they didn't know what. Another man leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles pale under the pressure. "You're standing in a room full of men who've already made their decision," he said. Bumpy's eyes moved to him, calm as ever. "Then why am I here?" he asked. The question landed harder than anything that had been said before, because it exposed something simple and uncomfortable. If the decision had already been made, if this was truly as controlled, as certain, as final as they claimed, then there would have been no need for a meeting at all. No need for him to be there. No need for 15 men to sit in a circle, waiting. The realization moved through the room slowly, like a ripple across still water. Dutch noticed it in the way one man shifted in his seat. Another crossed his arms. A third looked briefly toward someone else, as if searching for reassurance that no longer felt solid. They had come in believing they held control, but control does not need confirmation. And yet, here they were, seeking it. Bumpy took another step forward. Again, small. Again, deliberate. But this time, it carried something different. Finality. "You closed a man's shop," he said, his voice steady, but now carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "You didn't speak to him, didn't warn him, didn't give him a choice." No one interrupted, because now they were listening. Not by choice. By necessity. "And you thought," Bumpy continued, his gaze moving slowly across the room, "that no one would stand in front of you and say it wasn't right." The word "right" lingered. It wasn't about law, it wasn't about power, it was about something deeper, something none of them had prepared to defend. One of the men let out a quiet scoff, but it lacked conviction. "You don't get to decide what's right," he said. Bumpy looked at him. "No," he agreed calmly, "but I do get to decide what I stand for." That was the moment everything shifted. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But completely. Because until that point, the room had been operating on one assumption, that Bumpy was there to negotiate, to respond, to react. But now it was clear. He wasn't there for any of that. He was there to define the moment. And once a man does that, the room no longer belongs to anyone else. The man standing closest to him took a step back. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but in a room built on dominance, even the smallest retreat carries meaning. Dutch saw it immediately. And so did everyone else. The balance had shifted, not through force, not through numbers, but through something far more unsettling. Clarity. Bumpy let the silence return, but this time it was different from before. It wasn't uncertain. It wasn't searching. It was settled, because the truth had already been placed in the room, and now it had nowhere to go. One of the men finally spoke again, his voice lower now, less certain. What is it you want? There it was, the question. That changes everything. Not a demand. Not a threat. A question. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He let the weight of it sit, because what comes after that question defines everything that follows. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but carried something undeniable. I want you to understand, he said, that what you do doesn't go unanswered. No anger. No threat. Just certainty. And I want that man's doors open again. He added. A long pause followed. No one laughed. No one interrupted, because they understood something now that they hadn't before. This wasn't a man asking. This wasn't a man negotiating. This was a man deciding. Leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, the tension in his chest easing in a way he hadn't expected. He had come here anticipating conflict, something loud, something forceful, something immediate. But what he had witnessed instead was something far more powerful, because nothing had been broken, nothing had been forced, and yet everything had changed. The men in the room looked at each other, not for agreement, but for direction. But there was no clear direction anymore, no unified confidence. Just individuals, each confronting the same realization in their own way, that the moment they thought they controlled had never been theirs. Bumpy turned slightly, not fully leaving, but no longer centered in the confrontation. The movement was subtle, but it carried a message. He was done. The decision had been made. Now it was up to them what they would do with it. And in that silence, heavier than anything that had come before, the room understood one final truth. They had not been challenged. They had been revealed. There are moments in a man's life that do not announce themselves as important. They do not arrive with noise, nor do they leave behind anything visible to hold. And yet, long after they pass, they continue to exist, quietly shaping decisions, altering perceptions, and rewriting truths that once felt permanent. What happened in that room was one of those moments. After Bumpy Johnson spoke, the air did not move the same way it had before. It felt heavier, but not suffocating. It felt settled, as though something unstable had finally found its balance, not through force, but through understanding. No one answered him immediately. That, more than anything, revealed the truth, because men who are certain do not hesitate. They do not search for words. They do not look at one another for reassurance. But now that was exactly what was happening. Eyes shifted, postures adjusted. The unity that had once filled the room now seemed thinner, like a surface stretched too tightly over something that no longer held. Schultz remained still, his gaze moving from one man to another, recognizing something he rarely witnessed: control dissolving without resistance. He had seen men lose power before, but it always came with noise, with struggle, with something visible to mark the moment. This was different. This was quiet, and that made it undeniable. One of the men finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. You walk in here, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, and you expect things to just change? Bumpy turned his head slightly toward him, his expression steady, untouched by the weight of the question. I don't expect anything, he replied. A pause. I recognize what's already changing. That answer didn't challenge them. It unsettled them, because it suggested something they had not considered, that the shift they were feeling was not being forced upon them. It was already happening, already in motion, already beyond their control. Another man spoke, this time more carefully. And if we don't agree? The question hung in the air, but it didn't carry the same authority it would have just minutes earlier. It sounded less like a warning, and more like uncertainty trying to sound firm. Bumpy's gaze met his. Then you don't, he said simply. No threat. No escalation. Just acceptance. And that was the most disarming thing of all. Because conflict feeds on resistance. It grows through opposition. It thrives when both sides push against each other. But Bumpy wasn't pushing. He wasn't even pulling. He was standing, and in doing so, he removed the foundation the entire confrontation had been built on. Dutch felt it then, the full weight of what had just happened. These men had prepared for defiance, for negotiation, for resistance. They had expected to control the outcome by controlling the environment. But they had overlooked one thing. You cannot control a man who does not react to your control. The silence stretched again, but this time it carried something final. One of the men, seated near the center, placed his hands flat against his knees and leaned forward slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer mocking, no longer sharp, just measured. "That shop," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It'll open again." No one argued. No one laughed, because no one had the ground left to stand on. The decision did not feel like defeat. It felt like inevitability. Bumpy nodded once, not in victory, not in acknowledgement of submission, but in simple recognition of what had been said. And then he turned. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Just naturally. As if the moment had reached its end the second it needed to. He walked toward the door, the same way he had entered, calm, steady, unchanged. No need to look back, because a man who understands the moment does not need to confirm its outcome. Behind him, the room remained still. 15 men sat in silence, not because they had been silenced, but because they had nothing left to say. Dutch watched him reach the door, something unfamiliar settling in his chest. It wasn't admiration in the way he understood it. It wasn't agreement. It was something deeper. Recognition. He had spent years believing that power came from control of people, of situations, of outcomes. But what he had just witnessed challenged that belief in a way he could not ignore. Bumpy hadn't controlled anything. He had revealed everything. And in that revelation, control had shifted on its own. The door opened. Then closed, and just like that, it was over. But not really, because moments like that don't end when people leave the room. They follow, they linger. They settle into memory in ways that change how future decisions are made. The next morning, Harlem woke the same way it always did, with movement, with sound, with life continuing forward. But something beneath it had shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly. On Lenox Avenue, the shop door that had remained closed for days opened again. No announcement, no explanation, just a man returning to his place, standing behind his counter with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. People noticed, not loudly. Not all at once, but they noticed. And in that noticing, something began to spread. Not fear, not tension, but something else. Relief, respect, understanding. Because sometimes the most powerful change is not the one that makes noise. It's the one that restores what was almost lost. Dutch stood across the street for a moment, watching the shop, then looking down the road where Bumpy had disappeared the night before. He shook his head slightly, almost to himself, as if trying to reconcile what he had seen with what he thought he knew. But some things don't need to be understood immediately. Some things just need to be witnessed and remembered. Because long after voices fade, long after rooms empty and doors close, there are moments that remain quiet, steady, unshaken. Moments that prove something simple and undeniable. That dignity does not need to be defended with force. That respect cannot be demanded through fear. And that true power does not raise its voice. It changes the room.